Hello everyone. Welcome to Transformation of Transportation, Can It Be Green and Just? This is the seventh webinar in a series hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. This series is part of a Climate and Health Equity Fellowship, a program conducted in partnership with the National Medical Association's Southeast region to support the leadership of physicians of color in equitable climate change and health. This includes policy development, community education, and advocacy. I'm Dr. Mark Mitchell, Director of State Affairs for the consortium. Also joining me from the consortium to run this webinar are Dr. Kimberly Williams and Bev Harp. They will also be available through the chat to answer any technical questions during the webinar. This series of webinars is held for 1 hour on the second Friday of each month from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website for future viewing. Today, we're honored to have two outstanding presentations on the transformation of transportation and the realities of access to low-wealth communities. Our first presenter is Dr. Sacoby Wilson. Sacoby is an associate professor and director for the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health at the Maryland Institute of Applied Environmental Health in their School of Public Health at the University of Maryland and College Park. He is an environmental health scientist with expertise in environmental justice and environmental health disparities. Rather than using our time to provide further description of his impressive work, we're placing the link to his bio in the chat. Our second presenter is Dr. Cecilia Pinto de Moura. Cecilia is a senior vehicle engineer in the Clean Transportation Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. You may also find a more detailed description of her extensive projects in the chat. We are appreciative of the time and expertise in sharing with our community of climate and health advocates. The general format for today's webinar will be a little different from what we usually do. We will have a 15 to 20 minute presentation by each speaker, followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers at the end from you, our audience. However, Sacoby will need to leave immediately after his presentation, so we'll take 1 or 2 questions from him immediately after he presents. We ask that you put comments, links to any resources that you may recommend, or any questions that you may have for the presenters in the chat box at any time during the presentation. And again, if you can put questions in for Dr. Wilson, he will answer 1 or 2 questions at the end of his presentations. But we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A period at the end. So please keep yourself muted so you're not interrupted by background noise. Sacoby, you may begin.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Happy to be here today. Let me do a screen share. There we go. So again, I'm Dr. Sacoby Wilson. I'm an environmental health scientist, environmental justice advocate at University of Maryland College Park. Since I don't have a lot of time, I have too many slides, I'm gonna give y'all the moosh boosh version of my presentation. Just a little quick sample. So I'm gonna talk about environmental justice and environmental racism in transportation a little bit, and then the opportunity for us to move forward with these issues, right? What are some policy opportunities? Hopefully, I know about environmental justice, what it is. I just like to have a frame where it's a disproportionate burden of environmental hazards in certain communities. Those same communities have a high concentration of psychosocial stressors, and then they have a lack of access to health promoting infrastructure. If you think about equitable access to transportation infrastructure, really I like to leverage Antonovsky's framework of salutogenesis, promoting health, well-being, wellness across all dimensions of environment, built, natural, social, political, economic, and spiritual environment. So you think about salutogenic infrastructure. How can transportation be salutogenic infrastructure? So let's define the issues around transit equity in the U.S. We know that we're talking about supporting multimodal options that are affordable, sustainable, reliable, efficient, safe, and easy to use. You want to have quality transportation services that are accessible to all populations, and particularly when we think about those who are sort of dependent on mass transit and individuals who may have any type of disabilities as well. And also, you want to have inclusive processes where those individuals are engaged in decision-making processes as it relates to transportation, right? And that a lot of times doesn't happen. I'll try to get a couple of examples. So we have a lot of organizations that provide public transportation to 46,000 Americans. The public transportation sector has grown 37% since the 70s. We have 240,000 route miles in the U.S. And in 2019, 9.9 billion trips via public transportation. Yet, 45% of Americans do not have access to public transportation. So you think about folks during like climate change related perturbations, for example, climate change events. Think about Hurricane Katrina 16 years ago, last week, Hurricane Ida. Folks on low wealth usually may not be in a community that have access to public transportation. So why didn't they get out? Well, they may not have mass transit to get them out, right? So that's an intersection there for y'all to think about. So studies have shown that low income people of color have less access to public transportation. A study in DC found that 50% of white workers live near transit stops, while only 30% of white workers did not. Only 24% of black workers live near transit stops from 2011 to 2013. So you think about DC's metro system. I'm gonna say it like this: DC's metro system, those of you live in DC, is racist. You have some neighborhoods and some wards in DC that have basically no transit stops, right? They're basically they host the line, but they're just gonna stop. And there's some parts of DC, some wards, oh my God, they have multiple stops within multiple walking distance of each other. Y'all know what parts of DC I'm talking about. So this is an issue of transportation inequity that we see just in the DMV, just in the DC area. Historical context. Y'all probably already know about some of this, the history of redlining, the National Highway Defense Act, right? Urban renewal, which was basically urban removal. There were basically policies that were put in place that said we're going to build these highways and byways through black and brown communities on purpose to displace them. Look what happened with Tulsa. Y'all know about Tulsa. Do you know about the urban renewal in Tulsa? What about what's happened in Durham, North Carolina, right? Almost any major city that had a black and brown communities, where are the highways and byways at? The 2-lane, 4-lane, 6-lane highways. That is not by accident. That's by design, y'all. So you think about white flight and some our white residents who moved out of cities. Guess what? Also moved out with them. The services, right? Municipal services, infrastructure moved out with them too. Okay, and so that redlining segregation is a really important driver of this transportation inequity. And that, again, is grounded in what root cause racism. So what does this mean? Disparate access to cars. In 2017, 8% of white Americans were carless compared to 4% of people of color, right? 80% of our funding goes for surface transportation is allocated to highways. But folks who live in urban areas, that may be less income, they're relying on mass transit. So why are we putting in more money for cars and not putting more money in for mass transit, right? And you got to get the history of like America Beautiful and this American dream of became car dependent. Y'all can get into that history, transportation history, but that is part of it, right? And people can rely more on public transportation, and yet there's less funding and less access, right? So this is an issue again of transportation inequity. So what are these EJ issues, right? So what are the EJ issues in the transportation sector? Disproportionate air pollution. I'll get to that. Funding inequities, lack of representation in government decision making, over policing of public transit, right? Sort of the criminalization of public transit, disparate access, fewer stops or farther stops in local income communities, and then even it's just not the stops. Then you put the bus depot. You know what neighborhood I'm talking about. Then you have the bus depot with all the buses coming in, and think about all the exhaust being spewed out. And then lack of walkability to public transportation. It's not just you don't have access to public transportation. It's the fact that your neighborhoods, because of the highways and the fragmentation, you may have a bus stop that's nearby, but you might have to cross a major roadway to get there. So the lack of walkability is part of it, and accessibility to public transit is also a problem. It's a safety issue, it's a wellness issue, it's a public health issue, right? And so when you think about all these highways and byways going through communities, what happens? You're basically using the community as a sink for pollution. When you combust fossil fuels, you have combustion byproducts that produce. We all talk about climate change and greenhouse gases. Great, that's important. I'm not going to diminish that. But the co-pollutants are the ones that impact the human health. This is important for you medical professionals. Understanding like your patient who has asthma, it may be due to particular matter. Your patient who has diabetes may be due to particular matter. Your patient who has Alzheimer's may be due to particular matter. Your patient that has high blood pressure may be due to particular matter. So particular matter causes asthma attacks. It causes stroke. I need to slow down a little bit. My blood pressure may go up. Let me chill a little bit. I get high energy, y'all. High blood pressure, right? It increases infant mortality, birth defects, low birth rate births, right? It can contribute to cancer rates. Okay, it impacts more mortality and life expectancy. That's just one co-pollutant, right? When you think about when combustion fossil fuels, so think about the pregnant mother who lives in a community that has all these combustion byproducts and that exposure and what's happening to the developing fetus, right? That's an issue. And these toxins are not just leading to cancer; they also can mutate your DNA. There are also combustion byproducts that can impact neurocognitive development. So you basically have communities that your patients that you may be dealing with who are dealing with toxic trauma, y'all, toxic stress, multiplicative effects, right? And so what are the cumulative impacts on your patient population who live in communities that have air quality problems due to transportation? We call it TRAP, not trap music, transportation-related air pollution, y'all. So you think about COVID-19, like why has COVID impacted my community, my patient population so much, people around me? Well, if you live in a community with a lot of air quality issues related to transportation, right? That's part of the reason. You have air quality hotspots, and then you have these COVID-19 hotspots. It's not by accident, folks. You think about SARS-CoV-2, what does it do? If you look at somebody who has decreased lung function, right? Decreased respiratory function, decreased cardiovascular function, they're an easy target for a virus like SARS-CoV-2. Let me keep it moving. Then you also have black carbon. So you have a lot of buses, right? Mass transit buses, school buses that go through black and brown communities. Children of color disproportionately ride school buses compared to their white counterparts. When children are exposed to diesel exhaust on school buses or walking to the school, or when the intrusion comes into the school, right, from the buses, they're the island, that short-term exposure impacts the coordination, concentration, and focus. I know I said that fast, but when you got kids exposed to air pollution, it impacts the ability to learn. That's just a nugget for y'all. It's not on the slide. That's a different nugget for y'all. But you think about diesel exhaust, right? Some of the same health effects from exposure to particular matter are the same health effects for when things exposed to diesel exhaust. Diesel, there's 40 different cancer-causing agents in diesel exhaust, right? So you have buses and big industrial vehicles coming through your community. You've been exposed to these, again, combustion byproducts that impact human health. This is disproportionately impacting black and brown communities. These pollutants disproportionately impact low wealth communities. So, when you think about how you address the problem, we got to think about environmental justice and have an environmental justice strategy. We got to look at the interagency working group on environmental justice. I'm on NEJAC, EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So do we have an EJ plan, right? How do we address these issues to get to transportation equity? So you think about opportunities to do better. Think about TOD, transportation-oriented development, neighborhood revitalization, economic development, improvement of community health. Sometimes when you have this TOD, it's not equally distributed, right? There could be some negative issues. You can have gentrification. I mean, there's a whole uproar right now about the maglev. The maglev train, right? And the potentially of that being a gentrifier in the DC area. But also, you think about when you bring more transit in, if you're not thinking about electrification, for example, I will say this, I know that next speaker is going to get to this. I think electrification is a public health intervention. If we can electrify our fleet vehicles, if we can electrify our buses, right? Our postal vehicles, our big trucks, the garbage trucks, right? Of course, the commuter vehicles, that will lead to a huge reduction improvements in air quality, which should lead to reduction in negative health outcomes that I listed out, which should lead to reduction in health disparities, which should lead to reduction in the use of social and social and health safety nets, y'all. So if we could just improve the air quality alone, it have many benefits, economic, social, health, and environmental benefits. And doing it in the transportation sector is really important to focus on that. Okay, let me keep it moving. So when you do TOD, you can reduce traffic congestion, increase access to resources. So parks, green space, right? Improve street conditions, reduce the amount of land that we use, right? For highways and byways, right? But it can potentially lead to gentrification, increase rents. It can increase density and maybe some other issues. So you think about TOD. how do you balance? You want to focus on revitalization, but not have gentrification. Now, in DC, for example, I would say DC sustainability plan that some of y'all might look up, those in DC area, I would say the sustainability plan is a gentrifying plan. A lot of those folks in DC are being pushed out into Charles County and the Prince George's County. So I don't think that's going well. In Baltimore, you see a lot of gentrification. In a lot of our major cities, you have suburbanization movement where people move outright and who disproportionately benefit from white residents and folks of color, low wealth folks disproportionately impacted by it. Now you have everybody wants to move back in the city, so that people, it's the same folk. Is that so? This whole rubber band approach is leading to more development. When you think about TOD, it can be expulsive planning zone development. So if you think about transit and it's pushing people out, that's an environmental injustice, and we can't have that. So we need to focus more on revitalization and make sure those long-term residents benefit from the TOD, benefit from new transit opportunities. Okay, so you think about how you do this transit and do gentrification. You got to think about those consequences of that, right? So the very people that transit should be expanded to, as I just said, are often excluded from the benefits, and so who's impacted, right? We know lower income folks are more likely to take public transportation. So when this gentrification occurs, it causes higher income residents to displace those who use public transit. So we got to again be aware of that. So what do we mean by transportation infrastructure? So it could be highways, bridges, roadways, buses, train stations, airports, seaports, right? Think about the National Interstate Highways Act, as I said before, that led to a lot of displacement and highways and byways built through people's communities. Households that buy 90% income bracket spend 2 times the amount on the transportation the household in the top 10% do. I mean, so this is baked into our system, y'all. And so this leads to a lot of inequities in quality of life, right? People are spending so much time on buses, right, and trains to get to work. But also because the lack of access to food infrastructure, it may take 2 or 3 buses to get the grocery store because of folks dealing with food apartheid, right? So you call this transportation apartheid. You got food apartheid. Y'all know apartheid. You got medical apartheid. It's the system that's baked in the root causes. So regardless of the infrastructure we're talking about, you have these inequities in access, right? Right. So this goes beyond transportation. It gets the housing, this gets the food, this gets the healthcare, right? So quality of life impacts. So safe, affordable, accessible transportation is crucial to growth opportunity and health and well-being of people of color. So sometimes you got a spatial mismatch to where the jobs are and the people are. Again, food access, park access. We have this term recreational deserts, and as I just said, healthcare. So when you fix it, how does it look? So when you fix it, we can reduce greenhouse gases emissions, right? Like I said before. We can, reduce asthma prevalence. We can have better use of our land. You can preserve our open space, preserve our green space. Why can't we go back to before we have these highways and byways in these communities? Transform highways and byways back into greenways, right? So one of the things that happened in Maryland, we have an excellent transportation sector, a bill. You think about what happened with PennDOT in Pennsylvania, trying to dismantle systemic racism and equities work group, right? So there's some activities happening. You have this transportation and climate initiative. Now this is a regional collaboration with a lot of Northeast United States and DC to reduce carbon emissions from the transportation sector. So now the problem with this framework is it doesn't ensure carbon emission reduction in the most vulnerable communities. And I think it's just like I'm not a big fan of market schemes, just to put that out there. And no EJ advocate worth their salt is a fan of market schemes. So this would be a market scheme, just like the cap and trade market scheme in California, just like the regional greenhouse gas initiative. It doesn't work for folks who are already dealing with environmental racism. It doesn't work for folks who already don't have equitable access to transportation, right? In this case. So advocates are advocates for clean energy and clean fuel. I think, again, I said electrification is part of this, but then a lot of power plants, if your power comes from coal, well, who hosts the coal-fired power plants disproportionately? You know who? Folks that look like me, folks of color, Black folks, brown folks, and low wealth folks. Okay? So an alternative to TCI, and I went through that quickly, an alternative to TCI is the Climate Community Investment Act. So it's designed by 300 community-based organizations. Remember I said before, you want to have public participation in developing these policies. If you don't know anything about the 17 principles of environmental justice, look them up. Principle 5 and principle 7. Basically talk about people speak with their own voices. Communities that on the front line, fifth line, speak their own voices. Communities that don't have access or don't have equitable access, speak with their own voices. This is a better approach than TCI, right? And it also generates money through fees on pollutants per ton of carbon emissions. And so those fees can then be reinvested in those communities to do workforce development, to do green businesses, to make communities more walkable, livable, right? To bring in more green infrastructure, right? Bring us more trees, to do tree canopies, to do food canopies, right? That's how you make an ecotopia work, y'all. When you have communities speaking their own voices, and so the work is of the community, for the community, by the community. So if you take anything from this quick 15-minute amuse bouche I'm giving y'all, you got to engage communities. You got to engage the most impacted. You got to engage the contextual experts. So this is just a visual that shows you when you focus on pedestrian friendly, if you focus on biking and mass transit, see how much space is used, right? But when you have to bring in cars, look how much space you use. Look at the impervious surfaces that you have to, create. And it's not just important from an air pollution perspective, right? It's also important from a climate change perspective. So there's a lot of cost of traffic, y'all. There's 87 billion in lost productivity when people are stuck in traffic. And then also from a public perspective, when you're stuck in that traffic waiting to go 30, 40 minutes, you've been sedentary. So that contributes to, sort of obesogenic sort of driver of obesity and metabolic syndromes, right? I don't know all that stuff well, but y'all know what I'm talking about. Y'all are medical doctors. So case studies. So I was talking about impervious surfaces, right? Let's think about urban heat island issues. Y'all heard about heat island issues. These impervious surfaces. Any major city, you're going to see these heat islands. But Richmond, DC, this other cities, Baltimore, you see these problems, right? Where you have too many impervious surfaces, not just the you have a lot of housing, right? But like the roadways, the concrete, the asphalt, you're absorbing the heat. You have heat trapping pollutants, right? Climate forcing pollutants. And then that disproportionately impacts who again? Low wealth folks, elderly people, folks have underlying health conditions, right? And you see a lot of issues with heat related morbidity. So then you have issues of heat waves, right? So heat waves are poor. Heat waves are helpful to poor and the elderly. That's one of my things I like to say. So let's think about that. So I do work on goods movement. So what's goods movement? I know I'm going real quickly, and Mark, you can always jump in when it's time for me to shut it down. But goods movement is when we have a lot of. I showed on the previous slide. When you have a lot of goods coming in on our ships through the Suez Canal, Panama Canal, right? Those goods go to our ports, right? And then from our ports, you have intermodal vehicles that move the goods off the ships onto rail into big trucks, and they take from the rail to big trucks into warehouses. So you have the coastal ports, you have river ports, and then you also have a dry ports. We call big warehouses dry ports. I've been doing work in Charleston, South Carolina since 2007 on issues of goods movement, right? I want to show you a couple quick examples. I'm not going to cover these slides well at all. They're really light touch, but that's an example of where, if you think about the disproportionate impact of this movement and all the air quality impacts, what's happening for public health for folks that live in those areas? That's another part of this transportation discussion. It's just not the access to transportation. It's the fact that we transporting goods who's disproportionately impacted. So the same folks who don't have equitable access to public transportation are the same people who are disproportionately impacted by goods movement related transportation. Okay. So let me just say that we're doing work in Savannah, Georgia, same issue, working with communities doing what we call community science. Y'all may have heard the term citizen science. Folks collecting their own data, right? Look at the Baltimore Red Line issue, where the governor said, y'all don't need this Red Line project, but we have inequitable access again in Baltimore to transportation. This is a civil rights issue, y'all. It's just not an environmental. It's really a civil rights issue. Your right to transportation, and the fact that funding is not being used in a way to make sure everybody has equal access to transportation. Okay. In Cheverly, Maryland, we built a hyperlocal air quality monitoring network to look at air pollution. I talked about a particular matter before. Why is Cheverly important? Well, they have an Amazon warehouse that's coming in. We'll be monitoring around that warehouse. They also have traffic related 295 around them, right? So you have all this highway related traffic is impacting air quality in Cheverly. So we've been working with the town and the town of Cheverly, the mayor, some other town council to do monitoring there. We want to expand this out to Prince George's County to hit these places where have a lot of traffic issues, right? And just want to hit this real quick. And so you can see in parts of Prince George's County, because of the beltway impacts, you have a lot of people have long commutes, right? And again, you see less green space, and less tree canopy to mitigate them. You know, why are trees important real quickly, y'all? Trees are good for noise pollution mitigation, air pollution mitigation, heat mitigation, stormwater mitigation, right? Trees are good for playability, mental health, right? Food, etc. So when you don't have green infrastructure, when you don't have trees, you don't have that buffer against the air pollution that's associated with traffic. Okay, so just want to highlight that real quickly. The red line ridership is about 22% unemployment rate. So again, you see this intersection again of race and class when it comes to transportation access. We're building the purple line in Prince William County, and it's going to provide greater access for folks in like Langley Park and Bladensburg, et cetera. But it's providing access to people to go to jobs that's away from them. But they haven't really focused on TOD, transit-oriented development, that makes sure the jobs are in people's communities. It's better to have jobs in the community. Guess what? Why is that important? So that means you have less carbon emissions, right? If you got a job right down the street, you just can walk. If you had to get in the mass transit or drive to the job, that's more carbon being produced. So we got to bring jobs back to the people. We got to bring the parks to the people. We got to bring the healthcare to the people. We got to bring the food infrastructure to the people. Okay, I'm gonna stop, Mark, because I know I'm over time. So
Right.
I mean, let me stop there. I had way too many slides, y'all, but hopefully y'all got that moosh boosh and you like it. Thank you.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thanks so much, Sacoby. We really appreciate that. I know you need to leave to get to another meeting. I don't know if you want to take one or two questions before you.
I'll take them. I'll try to be succinct. I'm sorry, I went over. I went longer than I needed to go, but I'll try to be succinct.
Okay, so Bev, are there any questions? If anybody has questions to put in the chat, please do that now. But I just wanted to find out about, you talked about transit-oriented development, and I want to find out whether you were saying that there are pros and cons to that.
There are pros and cons. So with the TOD, you have to have equity integrated on the front end of it to make sure those voices, the ones who really need the transit and the ones who could be displaced by the transit, not doing well, are there at the decision-making table in the beginning. So one of the frameworks I think that's really important when you're doing transit-oriented development is the equitable development framework. So you got to bring in equitable development principles into TOD, and to make sure that rents don't increase as you bring the transit in, and you're doing all the bring the nice little boutique shops and the grocery stores near the transit, and that the people who were already living there, that they can still benefit from the infrastructure. Because what happens is if you don't do that, they will get displaced, and you'll have more people who have maybe other types of income who could come in and replace them. But that's not really fair. That's not really just, because then when they get displaced, they may get displaced into communities that have eroding infrastructure. So you're building this new infrastructure, but instead of getting access to that, they get pushed out to areas that have eroding infrastructure or lack of access to infrastructure. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I know that we could continue for a while, but I know that we need to move on and that you need to get to another meeting. So thanks so much again for coming and presenting. And have a good day. And we want your slides, so make sure you send them to us. Okay. Yep. So
take care.
Yeah. So now, okay, I'll see them. So now, let's thank you so much. So let's go ahead and move on to Cecilia. And so Cecilia, if you can go ahead and begin.
Hi, let me first share my screen. Okay. You all see my screen?
Yes.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you about my favorite topic, which is decarbonizing transportation with a people-centered approach. So vehicle electrification has been in the news a lot recently with the administration's plans and announcements from major automakers like Ford and GM that they're going all electric by 2030 and 2035, respectively. So I wanted to start by talking about a recent study that we did at Union of Concerned Scientists. So we modeled an economy-wide low-carbon energy system to study the feasibility of different pathways to cut carbon emissions and criteria pollutants. Our aim was to achieve net zero CO2 emissions no later than 2050. And on the way there in 2030, about half below 2005 levels. And these cuts are a minimum of what the US must do to contribute to global efforts to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. But our goals in the study went beyond climate change. We want to make changes that are lasting and systemic, as Dr. Sacoby Wilson mentioned, and that address equity. So these three goals together, reducing emissions from climate change, advancing equity, and driving systemic changes are the conditions for a successful transition to clean transportation. So how important is transportation in this effort? Well, this chart shows the findings from our main scenario in the study I mentioned. It shows the CO2 reductions by sector needed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 relative to a reference scenario, which is the white line up on top. So what's happening here? So in the short term, you can see that electricity, which is the dark red, plays a major role in reducing emissions. And as electrification advances, transportation, which is the orange wedge, takes on a larger role and contributes to half the reductions by 2050. So we have to think along the way of climate reduction, CO2 reductions is going hand in hand with local air pollution. We're reducing one, we're reducing the other. So how do we get there, right? What do we do? There are really four main strategies to achieve this decarbonization in transportation. The first one is a rapid reduction in the use of internal combustion engines and rapid transition to electrification. So we aimed in this study at 100% sales of zero emission vehicles for passenger cars and light trucks by 2035 and heavy trucks by 2040. The second strategy is to strengthen fuel economy standards, because we're still going to have a lot of internal combustion engines on the roads until about the mid 1940s, 2040s. And the third strategy is we have to decarbonize the remaining liquid fuel. In 2050, we're still going to have quite a bit of liquid fuels, a little less than 20% of what we have today. And the fourth strategy is to expand access to mobility, right? And at the same time reducing private driving and freight movement. And in one of our scenarios, we look at a low demand world where a more equitable world where there's less driving and public transit is doubled. And I should mention that this scenario was developed along with an equity advisory board. We have this distinguished group of people who work with us who are an integral part of every step in the project, including the design of the modeling scenarios. And I really think that this collaborative approach is one of the main original contributions of our study. So now I'd like to go into some more detail about electrification, which is one of the main strategies. Okay, so the first benefit of electrification are first and foremost, EVs have no tailpipe emissions. So electrification is of major importance to the health of people who live near highways and in urban areas. Disadvantaged communities, as Dr. Sacoby mentioned, are very often located near major roads, and communities are split by highways. And diesel exhaust is extremely harmful as it contains PM 2.5 and about 40 volatile organic compounds that are extremely highly carcinogenic. Dr. Sacoby mentioned all that. I won't go into the harmful impacts from PM 2.5. So what you see on the screen are findings from another study we did at Union of Concerned Scientists, showing that people of color are burdened with a disproportionately high exposure to PM 2.5 from on-road vehicles specifically. So for the US as a whole, African Americans are exposed to concentrations of PM 2.5 that are 24% higher than the exposure of an average US resident, while white people breathe air that is 14% cleaner. And at local levels, this inequity can be even worse. And by the way, there are many studies on this subject, including one excellent one by Harvard on the health impacts of various policies and the initiatives in the Northeast. So now on to the second benefit from electrification. Most people know that EVs have no tailpipe emissions, but what isn't obvious is the lower greenhouse gas emissions life cycle compared to internal combustion engines. In fact, there's a great deal of misinformation on the subject. So we calculated what the fuel efficiency of a hypothetical gasoline car would be that emits the same greenhouse gases as an average EV. So this map shows the equivalent fuel economy of a gas car that is equivalent to an EV. And in this average EV in the US emits greenhouse gases equivalent to a gasoline vehicle that gets 93 miles per gallon. That's the average. That's significantly better than the most efficient gasoline car, which gets about 59 miles per gallon, and far cleaner than the average new gasoline car, which gets about 31 miles per gallon, and or the truck. The new truck gets 23 miles per gallon, sold in the US. And looking at this in a slightly different way, this is such rich information. 97% of people in the US live where driving an EV produces less emissions than a 50 mile per gallon gasoline car. And this is anywhere, right? So even if you live in a state that has electricity generation from coal, it's still better to drive an EV. So the third, So the third benefit of electrification, sorry that my titles are being covered by instructions. So the third benefit of electrification now for the consumer, right? Fuel and maintenance savings, really, really important for individuals. This bar chart on the right shows the lifetime savings, fuel and maintenance added together for urban, suburban, and rural drivers in 4 states. The range of savings is from about $22,000 to $44,000 during the lifetime of a car. This is a huge difference for families that spend a disproportionate amount of their revenue on driving and maintaining their cars. And on the left is an example of fact sheets that we've published for almost every state, showing fuel savings for rural and city drivers, emission savings, and information on local incentives. For instance, here for West Virginia, charging an EV at home in Charleston is like paying $1 per gallon of gasoline, not $3. And why? This is a question I'm often asked. Why is operating and maintaining an EV so much cheaper? Right. So the factors that affect the fuel savings are how much you drive with a VMT, the efficiency of the 2 cars of an electric car or a gas car, and the relative prices, gas price, electricity price. Now, EV efficiency is really critical, right, in this difference, because an EV converts about 60% of the electrical energy from the power grid to turn the wheels. Whereas an internal combustion vehicle only converts about 20%, about a third of that energy from burning fuel into moving the car. So this means that an EV is roughly 3 times as efficient as an internal combustion engine. And of course, needing less energy to power your car brings down the cost of fuel. And even with today's relatively low gasoline prices, every electricity provider surveyed, we did a survey in the 50 largest US cities, offers a rate plan that would save the average EV owner on fuel costs with a median annual savings exceeding almost $800. So, yeah, and the factors affecting maintenance savings. Well, this is amazing. People don't really believe it when I tell them that an EV drivetrain has fewer than 20 moving parts compared to about 210 times in an internal combustion engine. So obviously maintenance is easier, right? So those are the 3 main benefits of electrification for the planet, for people living near roads, right? And for the drivers. However, there are additional benefits. Okay, there's performance, instant torque. Their EVs have a low center of mass, and so they have evenly distributed weight, and that helps the car stick to the road and expertly maneuver around curves and turns. And they perform well in all kinds of terrains, making them excellent candidates for rural areas. And also they're quiet, which improves the quality of life and also the health of people living near roadways. So now a touchy topic, EV prices. So although regular fuel savings are important, of course, the cost of buying a new EV, especially for low-income people, is still about $10,000 higher than a traditional gas car, before, that is, federal and state incentives. So the International Council on Clean Transportation estimates that 5 years from now, a 200-mile range passenger car will cost the same as a conventional car. And for SUVs, the break-even happens just a few years later. The dotted lines here show the break-even years for a 200-mile range vehicle. The top is cars, then there's crossovers, and then SUVs. So how about availability? Currently, there are about 20 models for sale in the US, and but the market's expanding very rapidly, and up to 100 EVs are planned for 2024. And there are many SUVs and pickup trucks on their way, favorite of Americans, including the hugely popular Ford F-150, so-called Lightning. Did you know that 1 in every 20 passenger vehicles sold in this country is a Ford F-150? So you can imagine what boost that's going to be for the EV market. Okay, batteries. So what are the concerns with batteries? The main issues around batteries are really 3: the price, the recycling, and the sourcing of materials. So the difference in EV and internal combustion engine prices is due primarily to the price of batteries. But the good news is that those are falling about 7% every year. Then used batteries, also an equity issue. Used batteries are considered hazardous waste. And there is tremendous potential for recycling and for second use of batteries. And in order to enable this widespread reuse of EV batteries, policy is going to be extremely important in reducing barriers and ensuring responsibility, equity, and sustainable practices around. There's a lot of work to be done there. And also, most electric vehicle batteries are lithium-based, and they rely on a mix of cobalt, manganese, nickel, and graphite and other primary components. But battery technology is improving very rapidly. So some already don't need cobalt, And other battery chemistries that rely on magnesium and other substances are also gaining momentum because they have higher energy density and they're lower costs compared to lithium-ion batteries. So it looks good. So I want to talk a little bit about the zero-emission vehicle program. It's considered one of the most forward-looking climate policies in the US, and it's helping to expand the EV market. So it's a California regulation that requires automakers to sell electric cars and trucks in California and 10 other states, and the exact number of vehicles is linked to the automaker's overall gasoline and diesel sales within the state. So how do automakers feel about the zero-emission vehicle program? Well, commitments from individual automakers show that there's an acknowledgement that the transition to EVs is inevitable. And most automakers have stated support for a fully electric future, GM, Ford, Volvo. But at the same time, what a lot of people don't know is that they've been funding trade associations that are fighting federal and state emissions regulations. So behind the scenes. So we can't rely solely on press conferences from car companies. We need to hold automakers responsible for their actions and for the actions of their trade association that would nullify their own stated green aspirations, right? So on another front, the California Air Resources Board adopted regulations called Advanced Clean Cars, which regulate criteria pollutants and greenhouse gases. And recently a new goal was added. All new cars and light truck sales must be electric by 2035. That's amazing. This program basically updates existing zero-emission vehicle rules. And then there's the Advanced Clean Trucks. Under this policy, a given percentage of truck manufacturers' sales in California have to be battery or fuel cell beginning with model year 2024. This is a great start, but this policy alone won't transition heavy-duty trucks to ZEVs, to zero-emission vehicles. There's a lot of work to be done here too. So, vehicle emissions and fuel economy standards. I've talked a lot about electrification. Electrification is critical, but it's only part of the solution. Since we're still going to have a large fleet of internal combustion vehicles spewing diesel exhaust and gasoline exhaust on the road. And most of the cars sold in the next 5 years are still going to be internal combustion engines, burning dirty fossil fuels. So we need to make sure that those vehicles are going to be as clean as possible by having very strong fuel economy standards and emission standards. And I'll leave you with this slide, and I'm not going to talk much about it. I'm recommending 2 publications with details on recent developments in this area. So now I want to talk about decarbonizing liquid fuels. For a variety of reasons, as I've already mentioned, we're going to have a large fleet of fossil fuel burning cars on the road. But then there's also these really hard to decarbonize sectors such as aviation. And this chart summarizes one of the main results from our decarbonization study, the one that I mentioned in the beginning. It shows the use of liquid fuels for transportation decreasing over time. And we can reduce liquid fuel use by 84% by 2050. But that still leaves 16%. It's still a lot that needs to be decarbonized. And well, there are 3 ways to decarbonize liquid fuels and make air quality better. So first of all, the use of, let me go back actually. There are 3 ways to decarbonize liquid fuels. Biofuels, that includes jet fuels. And by the way, the administration just announced yesterday or today a goal of replacing all jet fuel with sustainable jet fuel by 2050. That's great news. Ethanol use will also be reduced over time, but it's still going to remain important as a high octane fuel, especially if higher ethanol blends like beyond E15 are approved. So the second way to decarbonizing fuels is with what they call electrofuels, such as synthetic diesel and synthetic jet fuel. These are produced through electrolysis, which produces hydrogen from breaking down water with electricity, and carbon is then added to the hydrogen to produce these synthetic fuels that are identical to the fossil fuels in terms of their chemistry. This process advances decarbonization if the hydrogen is green. In other words, if it's produced from green electricity, but not so much if it's produced from coal burning electricity. So the third way to decarbonize is using carbon capture in petroleum products, but this is not a preferred solution. We'd like to leave fossil fuels in the ground. So the clean fuel standards. This is really important. Clean fuel standards have been around for more than a decade in California and Oregon and have been attracting recent attention in several states. Washington, Nevada, Colorado, Nebraska, a bunch of other states. In a clean fuel standard, a gradually decreasing carbon intensity is set. Fuels get cleaner and they generate credits, and the polluting fuels generate deficits. Now, note that this is at no cost to the government or to taxpayers. It's a way to make polluters pay without any cost to taxpayers or the government. And a national low carbon fuel standard is a more flexible policy and would replace the current renewable fuel standard, because the renewable fuel standard is solely biofuel based, but the low carbon fuel standard would support electrification. And it would hold oil companies accountable. And it's also an incentive for biofuel producers to produce cleaner fuels. And really important, it includes farmers, right, who would get credits for healthy soil practices, and particularly as crops with less carbon produce biofuels with less carbon.
Cecilia,
yes. Am I almost done?
Yes.
Yeah, let me just wrap up then. So the fourth strategy is public transit, that Dr. Sacoby has already covered. And in conclusion, I would just like to say that, well, we need to be science-based and we need to collaborate. And there is no one policy to rule them all. We need electrification. We need strong fuel economy standards. We need clean fuel standards. We need policies for automakers and for farmers. And the climate crisis and pollution from air, water, and soil must be addressed together, as they share root causes. And this transition to a clean and modern transportation system is our opportunity to make equitable systemic changes. So thank you very much. I leave you with a few topics that I haven't been able to cover because of time: charging infrastructure, the budget reconciliation plan, evolution of electrification in more detail. So thank you very much. Here's my email address in case you have questions. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Cecilia. It was really informative, and it's clear why you and Sacoby are seen as leaders in the environmental health and transportation equity areas. We might have time for a couple of questions. Bev?
I have one question. This is Linda Walden, Dr. Walden. Thank you so much for your presentation. What is going on now? Because I notice a lot of car lots in our area don't have many electric cars available. And they said there's some kind of problem going on with the electric vehicles, something about the chip or something. Can you tell me?
So there are electric cars rely on microchips, and there are manufacturers who are not producing enough chips to go around for all the cars, but this is something that is being addressed. And the other reason, there are many reasons actually you don't see that many cars in lots. It's that right now the the sales rate is still pretty low. It's 3 to 4% for the country and higher in California. But automakers are rushing to put out more cars. So sometimes you walk into a dealer and there aren't that many EVs available. That's something that we need to address, and it's not easy. And so it's not only the question of battery prices and all the sourcing. Sometimes the materials also aren't available. It's, as you said, also other components sometimes are missing. But it's a rough ride getting there. And
So to
I
speak.
think 5 years from now, things are going to be very different.
So yeah, so I know the discussion could go on for much longer, but we need to wrap up this session. So I'd like to thank our speakers and would like to thank all of you for participating in this month's webinar. I hope that you found it useful. Next month's webinar will be for October 8th, and our topic will be community, climate and health, adaptation and resilience. So I encourage you to register and attend if you're able. We'll send a follow-up email with a list of recommended readings and resources on the topic of transportation. But before you leave, we ask that you please take a moment to fill out the webinar below. The link is, fill out the webinar survey. The link to the survey is now in the chat. And so we'd like to thank our sponsors, Johnson & Johnson, the Energy Foundation, and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their generous support of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program and of this webinar. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you and have a good day.